All right, everyone, we are just about at the top of the hour. So I want to kick off with some housekeeping items so that we can all take best advantage of today's hour of content. First and foremost, welcome to all of you who are with us today, and thank you for your membership with SCRS. If you are currently not a member, please visit us at myscrs.org and learn more about membership benefits. We do run these webinars almost weekly, so lots of great content, lots of exposure to experts in our field, so it's definitely a benefit for you to consider. And for today, we are going to be talking about diversity. I'll let our speakers really get into the meat of the content, but we do want to make sure that you get the most out of today. So we want to encourage you to ask your questions. And we're going to take questions today using Q&A functionality, and you should see that in your control bar. So you can go ahead and put your questions in there, and our panelists will look to answer those questions. If not when they come in, they will reserve time at the end to do so. So we're excited about bringing the speakers on today. If this is content that works for you and you need more about, we are doing more diversity webinar series in the upcoming weeks. So please do look at our schedule for that. And then also, if you are looking at different types of content that can help your site, we are running the Asia Pac Summit on July 13th and 14th. And then our global summit will actually be in person in Hollywood this October. So please consider attending. We're glad that everyone has stayed safe over the past couple of months. We hope that everyone's family is safe, and we are looking forward to that opportunity for us all to get back together to learning. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Nick. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Dawn. And big thank you to the SCRS for pulling us together today to discuss the scientific and ethical imperative for patient diversity in clinical trials, which I would hope at this juncture is a well-known topic to the audience, which is why you've dialed in. And I think what we would like to do today with my colleagues is to really think about what we can learn from evidence-driven approaches, in particular, some excellent work that was done jointly by the FDA and AACR, which Amit, who is joining us, participated, as did I, and how intentional planning can give us both practical and operational insights on how to address this really important issue. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Dawn. So my name is Nick Kenny. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for Syneos Health. I'll be moderating today's discussion. And really my background and interest in here is that I have the privilege not only to sit on our own Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, but to drive our company-wide efforts around supporting better patient diversity in clinical trials for the many sponsor companies that we work with. I am thrilled to be joined by two valued colleagues from Bristol Myers Squibb, who in many ways are leading lights in adaptation to diversity, both in terms of their own work, but also in generously giving to not-for-profits who are supporting these initiatives. So first, Lorena Curie, who is the head of diversity strategy at Bristol Myers Squibb, leading their efforts for diversity in clinical trials. Lorena is a native of Mexico who had about a 14-year career in the commercial side of our business before realizing that she wanted to follow her passions, become very socially engaged in patient diversity. And you may see her in groups such as Women of Color in Pharma and many other active groups. So welcome, Lorena. It's a pleasure to have you join us. Dr. Amit Agrawal is a board-certified hematologist oncologist who is the vice president and global lead for a lot of the work that Bristol Myers Squibb are doing in multiple myeloma. Formerly a faculty member at the University of Arizona, where he actually did a lot of translational research in multiple myeloma. And Amit has also been very closely engaged with ASCO's activities around the significant disparities that we see and continue to see, unfortunately, in cancer disparities. So Amit, thank you also for joining us. It's a great pleasure. And I'm also joined by one of my colleagues from Syneos Health, Dr. Roxanne Rodney, who is a triple certified cardiologist, nuclear cardiology, and internist who works in our team. And Roxanne brings a perspective both as a principal investigator in an academic medical setting, a former CMO in biotech and medical leader in pharma, and now as a medical leader in our practice dealing with cardiovascular disease. And Roxanne is very active in this area, particularly with the American Heart Association. So welcome, everybody. I really appreciate you giving up your time to share your own journeys and interests in some practical applications. And if we can go to the next slide, please, Dawn. So really, I think our objectives today are quite straightforward. It's to hear how both pharma and service providers are collaborating for sustainable and meaningful change around patient diversity in clinical trials. I think we want to have Roxanne give you an appreciation for the physician perspective from the clinical trial spectrum, and then learn what we can learn from a specific disease area, in this case, multiple myeloma, how we can use real data, real world evidence, and true data coming out of the FDA about diversity in clinical trials and use that to effect a change in support of the scientific and ethical rationale for patient diversity in clinical trials. We will have an open access question and answer session, and as Dawn has said, please feel free to submit your questions as we go through the meeting. So I think without further ado, let me pass this over to you, Lorena, for your perspective about the efforts that you and your colleagues at BMS are making.
Thank you, Nick. Always a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the framework that you have presented to everyone. So hi all, my name is Lorena Curi, and as Nick said, clinical trial diversity is my full-time job. I am very privileged to be in a company that has been looking at this way longer than from 2020 and on. So today I will just share three main slides that I wanted to bring as part of the perspective on why this is important, but also share a little bit of how we are addressing it. So if we can please go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So this slide is just realizing everything that we already know. Healthcare needs to work for all. No, there is a need for greater diversity in clinical trials. And this is not just a moral imperative, this is also a scientific imperative. We all understand that there are some diseases that disproportionately affect some populations more than others. And luckily, COVID was impactful enough to open this world to many other stakeholders within the industries and patients and caregivers. So this is now a very important topic that we are all aware of, right? But as I said before, we need to understand that incidence, prevalence, and outcomes may differ from one race to other, but also we need to consider that there are so many different dimensions of diversity that we need to look into. However, what we are doing at this time and what we're trying to increase and focus our efforts is in assuring that the clinical trial participation of our patients numbers are improving with regards to race and ethnicity, and more importantly, at this time within the US. This is a staged approach. So if we can please go to the next slide, which speaks of how this need is multifactorial, right? And those are the barriers that we need to break if we want to go to an entire clinical trial participation. So the next slide, please, will walk us through some of the reasons behind. And I am sure that if you're participating in the session, I don't need to spend much time of this. I would be preaching to the choir. But we need to understand, again, as I said, this need is multifactorial, from access to screening to lack of representation or affordable medicines. It's about where we are running our trials, exactly where are the sites, how close they are to the communities. It's about who is running our trials, how does our principal investigators look like, how are their referrals, how are their behaviors to underserved communities. It's about what is the message that we're giving to our patients and caregivers. Are these messages culturally appropriate? Are these messages open enough to engage with their communities before, during, and after trials, so we can rebuild the trust? That is very important. And it's also about how we build our trials. It's about how does our eligibility criteria looks like, how does inclusion and exclusion are looking into the most prevalent conditions of the populations that we want to study. And yes, we need to remember as well that all the social determinants of health are very important for us to look into. It's not only about logistics or transportation. There are many things that are embedded in this important need. So I will just spend a couple of minutes now on the following slide, because I want to share a little bit about how Bristol Myers has put in place this robust program to increase the patient diversity of our clinical trials. So the next slide, please, is the one that will walk us through how we are doing it. We're very clear on our objective. We have defined that our aim, our goal is to improve the patient population so it's more reflective of one, the real world population, and two, the epidemiology of the disease that we are studying. It's a data-driven decision making at all the points of our effort. So it is truly meaningful and brings us back to this scientific imperative as well. And of course, it is built in a very robust foundation within our enterprise that is aligned with our health equity objectives. It leverages the powerfully diverse and broadly inclusive culture that we believe in. We all know that intentional inclusion drives innovation, and the more diverse the workplace is, the more diverse the marketplace will be. But the third point is what I wanted to highlight even more, because our objective is, our program is process driven. We're aiming for permanence. We want this to be a sustainable approach. I always say that I am looking forward to the time that my role is no longer needed, and everybody within our group and everyone else around pharma thinks about clinical trial diversity from design. As I said, the project outcomes are, yes, going back to increasing the opportunity for clinical trials for all the patients. We'll go back to what I said on that healthcare needs to work for all. But also it provides opportunities for accelerated innovation and transformative medicines that are aligned with our company's goals. We do have now a very robust culturally sensitive build that we have been putting together in collaboration with our people and business resource groups. And of course, we're looking into everything that our health authorities are saying here in the US and around the world. So the way that we're looking at this, as I said before, is process driven, and a lot of our efforts are focusing on the diversity of our research sites. And it's about how we select them, how we support them, how we train them, how we help that they self-assess themselves with the support of amazing tools like the SCRS DSAT tool, just to share with you guys. And that's how we have been doing it for the past 2 years. I am sure that there will be some more questions to come as we move forward, and I am looking for a very engaging conversation with the rest of the panelists, Nick. But I think now I need to hand it over to Roxanne.
Yeah, and Lorena, just while we're making that transition, I just want to pull out a few threads. I think that you made a number of key points, right? So first, I think sustainability is important, right? Mm-hmm. As an industry, whether it's on the pharma side, the site side, or the CRO side, this is not about dipping in and dipping out to meet diversity needs for a trial. I think, as you said, this is before, during, and after to create something that's sustainable, that builds trust in a community, not just targeting people to meet the needs of a clinical trial. And I particularly like the fact that your ultimate goal, as you said, is to make yourself redundant so that diversity is our new normal and not something we continue to have to revisit and reinforce. So I think that's an admirable set of goals, Lorena. So thank you. So Roxanne, let's pass this over to you.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you everyone for taking time out today to join us in this conversation. Certainly I want to acknowledge the contributions that Lorena and BMS is making, because they are one of the sponsor leaders with regard to a commitment to diversity in the clinical trial arena. I would just like to share with you some of my perspective. I've had the opportunity to lead clinical research from several settings, from 3 different settings. First, after completion of my fellowship, I joined an academic medical center, And there I was able to both conduct my own investigator-initiated trials, and I also participated in multi-center trials. And certainly as a physician, one recognizes that by conducting clinical trials is how we move the field forward, because all of the treatments that come to impact our patients that we are taking care of essentially are generated through the process of clinical trials. So certainly there is a significant importance with regard to the conduct of clinical trials. Then I've also had an opportunity within pharma, device companies, and also biotech, small biotech, large pharma, to continue to engage in clinical research. And of course, the perspective within pharma sponsor companies is that one needs to assess the safety and efficacy of new drugs. Again, and the mechanism by which that is achieved is through conducting clinical trials. And now that I have an opportunity to lead trials in partnership with sponsor companies here at Syneos Health, I think our goal is the same. I sort of see it as our function as an extension of the sponsor company, because we work closely in partnership with the sponsor companies. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, delving in a little bit with regard to my role as a principal investigator when I was in academic medicine, what is the clinical mandate? The mandate is that a clinical trial population should definitely be reflective of the epidemiology and the disease burden of the particular disease under investigation. It is a sample set, and the more robust the data with regard to reflecting that clinical trial, with regard to reflecting the patient population, the more reflective that the clinical trial population is with regard to the patient population, the more robust the data and the more confident treating physicians are with regard to being able to implement that clinical data from the trials. And certainly it informs that translational research applicability to patient care, because as physicians, our goal is to practice evidence-based medicine. Certainly you want to ensure that the patients that you're treating, that there is data within that patient population to support the treatments that are being prescribed. Also, the Belmont Report, which was issued back in 1979 by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. That commission was formed subsequent to the unearthing of the abuses that had occurred with the Tuskegee study. And there are three foundational principles of the Belmont Report. They are respect for persons, beneficence, which means do well for those patients in the study, and justice. Justice demands that the benefits of advances in medicine, particularly now that we are in an era of precision medicine, This must be accessible to all patient populations, not just patients of European ancestry. Clinical trials, as I mentioned, are certainly part of our continuum of healthcare, and they're needed for the advancement of healthcare. The physician PI has a central role, just as physicians have to establish a clinical rapport with their patients in order to achieve compliance with treatments that are prescribed. I think that that rapport can be extended with regard to establishing with that patient a comfort level with regard to engaging in clinical trials and fostering that trust that is foundational with regard to patient being comfortable enough to participate in a clinical trial. And certainly the conversation needs to occur with the patient with regard to the purpose of the study. And again, it should be inclusive. There should not be bias on the part of healthcare providers with regard to inclusion or approaching patients to consider participation in clinical trials. Certainly, diversity in the clinical research staff is important. I think particularly if the PI is not a person of color, I think it does contribute to that level of trust, given the historical abuses that have occurred, as we're all aware of. And also, just to be practical with regard to trying to accommodate patients, because we all realize that we're only seeing one aspect of a patient's life and their schedule. And I think we must do our best to try to make that process as seamless as possible for the patient to participate in a trial. Next slide, please. With regard to the perspective from a sponsor company, now, as I indicated before, the mandate for sponsors is that one needs to generate safety and efficacy data in the patient population for the particular investigational product. There's always a target product profile, and which would lead into the labeling that one would try to obtain for the investigational product. And as I mentioned before, the clinical trial is a data sample. And as such, that clinical trial population demographics should reflect the patient population who are impacted by the disease. As much as possible, sponsors should work to have what I refer to as real-world trial design. I've certainly designed many trials myself, and I think that sometimes there has to be a balance between obtaining data and realizing that you have to focus on what are the most impactful assessments, what are the data points that are the most necessary. And I think that's how my clinical background has helped me in that regard when I was in pharma and device companies, because you want to minimize the burden on the patient. You don't want to obtain data points just because, oh, that would be great to have. It would be great to have this information or that information. You know, just realize that it's clinical research, and you try to have not much of a burden on the patient. So a focused approach, I think, is helpful. And also with regard to inclusion and exclusion criteria, we have to ensure that there's not a selection bias there within that criteria, and that there is indeed equity of access for patients, in that sometimes criteria can be so narrow whereby it is too exclusionary with regard to patient population. And as Lorena mentioned, with regard to the efforts that BMS is undertaking, the intentional planning that is necessary with regard to PI and site selection, also the utilization of decentralized trials, and an adaptive trial design. And that refers to having real-time monitoring of enrollment demographics, such that adjustments can be made to recruitment if necessary. And this session is termed, the scientific and the ethical imperative. There's also, beyond that, there's a very practical imperative for sponsor companies, in that there is accountability with regard to data limitations. When there are gaps in data, the FDA can issue an approval, but the label can be restrictive. The label can indicate that there's not sufficient data in certain patient populations. I led a clinical trial in a lipid lowering study when I was in pharma. And that study was solely run in African-American patients. And that was because the pivotal study that was conducted did not have a very diverse patient population. And so a post-approval study was needed, so that the label could then be revised. So that's certainly a significant impact with regard to an approval. Also, additionally, journals are moving more towards reviewing very carefully the subject demographics, and that if there are indeed a lack of diversity, if there is a lack of diversity, the data gaps that have been identified will again be pointed out in the journal. Also, there's an impact with regard to treatment guidelines, in that the guidelines may indicate that there is indeed data gaps. Next slide, please. And with regard to the clinical research organization perspective, as I indicated, our mandate, I think, is an extension of the sponsor mandate. We frequently are in charge of obtaining designing the informed consent, and certainly making that less burdensome in non-technical language. IRBs are looking at patient recruitment demographics very closely. And the demographic data that is collected, certainly race and ethnicity as social constructs are definitely predictors of social determinants of health. And I'm very much in favor of including genetic or geographic ancestry as additional demographic data, because this has been shown to be a better predictor of the presence of certain genetic variants, which do have an impact with regard to the exposure and response to investigational products. And finally, we must also address a lack of diversity in genomic research databases. If this is not addressed, access to precision medicine and suboptimal clinical outcomes will be perpetuated. So I think with that, we will move on, and I will transition to Dr. Agarwal. Thank you.
Yeah, Roxanne, thank you for that. Just while we're making that transition, a couple of quick points, and then something I would definitely like the panel to come back to. I think excellent point about from the investigator perspective, it's that clinical rapport. And it really becomes that sort of discussion about people like me are the people that I trust and want to work with. And I just want to call out, for example, the work that the BMS Foundation has done in supporting groups like the National Medical Fellowships to support training of minority investigators in a very, very big way. I know the inclusion exclusion bias is something I think Amit's going to touch on from the myeloma findings. And, you know, I think the label restrictions is an interesting, if you like, enforcement, because that has both clinical implications, you said, on treatment guidelines, but also access to the medicine. It can have commercial outcomes and certainly a health impact if the medicines have that label on them. So definitely some things to come back to, I think, when we have the panel. So Amit, with that, let us turn you loose to share the myeloma journey. I think you might still be on mute, Amit. There you go.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick, and very happy to be here and really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. But real quick, my name is Amit Agarwal, and as the title says here, I'm the medical affairs lead for multiple myeloma. And what I wanted to do today was really talk a little bit about, as we look at this sort of topic around racial disparities, use sort of multiple myeloma as a case study to illustrate several things that, you know, apply to multiple myeloma. But listening to both Lorena and Dr. Rodney earlier, it's very clear that these also have broader implications, but at least, you know, it helps us think about a case study, if you would. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Maybe for folks who are not as close to multiple myeloma, you know, something that I'm very passionate about is the disease of plasma cells. So it's essentially a cancer of plasma cells. These are cells that would normally be producing immunoglobulins in our body. And it approximately affects 30,000 new patients every year in the United States. So it's a fairly common disease. It's the second most common blood cancer occurring in the United States. And what's interesting about myeloma from an incidence perspective, relevant to the topic today, is that the incidence rate is actually much higher in African Americans, in some studies suggesting twice as much as those in the white, especially the European ancestry folks. But what is also very interesting about the disease in African Americans is that there are some inherent differences in the characteristics of the disease when we talk about multiple myeloma in African Americans compared to, compared to sort of the white population that we normally see in that case. One is the African American patients tend to be much younger. So there is a condition called MGUS, or smoldering multiple myeloma, which is almost like the pre-cancer for multiple myeloma. And very sort of elegant studies that have been done in that setting have shown that the incidence of that particular condition is really double that of whites compared, you know, in African Americans is double that of whites, and also the rate of progression is higher. And so as a result of that, African Americans tend to be younger. What is also very interesting is that the genetic composition of the disease is also different in African Americans compared to other populations. And so what that leads to really is a very sort of interesting intersection here of not only the usual socioeconomic and other factors that we talk about, from a disparities perspective, but also an inherently different biology for multiple myeloma in African Americans. And so it really leads to some very interesting opportunities for us to both study the disease as well as address some of these disparity issues. Now, one of the challenges we've had, has been mentioned in other settings, is really that despite that higher incidence of the disease in African Americans, the clinical trial enrollment has lagged, especially more so in the recent years for African Americans for multiple myeloma trials. And in particular, when we look at new drug applications, when we look at studies where a drug is being studied for the first time, especially for registration and initial approval, those studies have really been struggling with African American enrollment. And so with that background in mind, the FDA really sort of, collaborating with the AACR primarily, brought together this cross-functional collaboration and group of the regulatory authorities in terms of the FDA, the stakeholders like AACR, pharma groups, patient advocacy groups, so really bringing together a wide array of stakeholders to try and discuss and come up with some really actionable solutions, if you would, for this particular problem. And we as BMS had an opportunity to participate in that. If you can go to the next slide, please. So out of that workshop, which really sort of had several work streams and eventually a second workshop to really read out some of these findings and recommendations, a very nice paper came out of this, which was recently finally published in print. And I would really encourage the group here to check out this paper and read it. And my colleague, Dr. McIver, is one of the authors on this particular study. But really, they broke down the recommendations into three phases, which again I found was very practical. The first one is the pre-approval, or really, when we're doing the trials before we get to the trial stage of some of these drugs. The second one is during and right after the trial conduct, and then the third one is a little bit more further out, looking at the real-world studies. And this is really linking back nicely to what Dr. Rodney was mentioning of how we need to study some of these aspects. But coming back to the pre-approval clinical trial stage, so some of the recommendations were around broadening of eligibility criteria. We heard this from Dr. Rodney as well. It is important to ensure that the eligibility criteria reflect the disease, they reflect the population that is being studied, and in particular, to use Dr. Rodney's words, the target patient population is very critical to consider here. The second recommendation was really around the diversity study plan for the trial sponsor. And really the components here that would be important to focus on, the first thing would be to ensure that concrete targets are set for enrollment of minorities. And so I sort of relate this to weight loss. You have to set a target before you do it, just so that you know what you're achieving or trying to achieve. The next thing is pre-specifying analyses and endpoints. So again, to ensure the statistical rigor is there, some of these endpoints and subgroups have to be defined a priori. And then finally, just outline strategies to enroll, accrue, and retain these populations. So it's very important to be very mindful and deliberate about some of these plans. And so really the recommendation was for the trial sponsors to look at this in a very mindful manner. Related to that is the appointment of a diversity officer. So really the role of this particular individual would be to ensure that some of these things that are outlined in the study plan are occurring as sort of initially planned and projected. The next thing, which is a little bit more myeloma specific, is to sort of think about these designs to encompass the disease subtypes and features most commonly seen in African Americans. And so I was mentioning cytogenetics earlier. A particular cytogenetic change, translocation 1114, is actually commonly seen in multiple myeloma in African American patients. And actually, I'm very proud of this work, but going back almost 4 years, our group at Celgene BMS was the first one to demonstrate that the outcomes of these patients, the African Americans, actually have a different outcome when looking at this 1114 population compared to the white population with the same cytogenetic changes. Similarly, looking at safety monitoring in African Americans, whether it's from a safety reporting perspective, but also understanding PK and PD, because there are true pharmacogenomic differences which need to be studied. And all this while being very sensitive and compliant about collecting this data in a sort of, again, appropriate manner, and especially when it comes to the racial and ethnic data collection is concerned. And ultimately, the recommendation was to review these plans and the sort of overall strategy with the FDA through the process of interactions. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, what about while we're conducting these studies and sort of, as these studies are just finishing up, so in that immediate post-approval setting. And here the recommendations were to conduct pre-specified analyses. So again, if the study has these subgroups defined, it becomes much more easier to be able to conduct these pre-specified analyses to demonstrate a risk-benefit in these specific populations. And so that's an important part of this. And if the data are insufficient, then pilot studies or expansion cohorts may have to be utilized. And so this is another place where the FDA is really encouraging sponsors to start looking at either expanding the cohort or ensuring there are enough patients in those subgroups to make meaningful conclusions. The FDA does recommend pooling some data from a couple of different studies if one study is not enough to do some of these analyses. So they are certainly flexible from that perspective. And ultimately, the recommendations for increasing diversity here in this post-approval study is to maybe look at modernizing eligibility criteria again, or post-marketing study where the eligibility criteria does not have to be as restrictive as the initial approval study. And really, I think engaging with patient advocacy groups, going back to what Lorena was saying, for us to really build that base, if you would, for ensuring that minorities can be enrolled and stay on the studies. And finally, incentivizing inclusiveness. So this is a little bit more on the policy side and the government relations side, but for example, engaging with Congress for providing incentives for conducting some of these clinical trials, whether it's mechanisms similar to orphan drug designations or the pediatric indication studies, and also again discussing this with the FDA review divisions, just to ensure that they are aware of these plans and they can help with the monitoring and the accrual of these targets. And then if you go to the next slide, please. Finally, I think, really some things that can pretty much be done across the board without any sort of really reason not to be able to do these are some of the real-world studies, right? And so real-world data should be collected and used for further assessment. This includes using registries to interrogate the safety and efficacy of these populations. In multiple myeloma at BMS, we do have a couple of large registries that we mine for data all the time. And one of the things that we have been able to do quite successfully, but after some hard work, is being to define these endpoints in the registries, because the way the data is collected, the way the data is collated in registries is not the same as in clinical trials. So a lot of times this is done in retrospect, fitting in with the usual care of the patient, which again is very important. But at the same time, as we think about some of these endpoints that we want to apply for multiple myeloma, those don't translate directly, and so they do require some sort of calculations and some definition changes at the back end to be able to make meaningful interpretations of those. So this was another recommendation from this particular group. And really thinking about the data that's being collected, again, in these settings where patients are being treated in real world, you don't want to overburden either the site or the patient by having too many data elements which really don't fit into the normal care of the patient, so being mindful of that. And similar to what I was saying about the endpoints, also employing a common reporting framework so that when we're reporting some of these findings, we're doing so uniformly as stakeholders. And ultimately, I think, one of the other encouraging pieces was around trying to use these real-world data sets or meta-analyses to start generating some hypotheses, which can then be tested in randomized studies. So again, I think feeding that research engine, if you would, to really get to the biology and some of the differences in the outcomes, in particular, again, in multiple myeloma. That was my last slide. So with that, back to you, Nick.
Yeah, Amit, thank you. That really is a good overview. And I think maybe just before we go to Q&A, just a couple of quick notes from myself. I think maybe for our colleagues at SCRS, if anybody would like the links to that meeting that Amit is referring to, the FDA AACR workshop, we can certainly provide those. I think you will find the information in there, which is very detailed, to be very compelling, because it tells the story of a disease, unpacking that disease and who's impacted. It actually pulls real FDA data about who was and who was not included in, I think, more than a dozen new drug approvals in myeloma, which is really informative. But also there are some great stories from institutions that have affected significant change in their own behaviors to try and address disparities in the myeloma setting. I mean, I think Winship comes to mind as one of them, but there were others. So it was an all-around great representation. We certainly can send those things out. And I think, Amit, you've really highlighted that when we have actionable data, you can actually do intentional planning. And to me, I think some of the congruence between what you're saying about the underlying drivers of disease and what Roxanne was saying in a similar vein about precision medicine has got to be very powerful, right? So thank you for sharing that with us, Amit. I know we had one question come in through the chat that I'm going to pass to Lorena, but she's having a little trouble with her audio connection at the moment. So maybe Amit and Roxanne, I'll throw a question to you that we've had in advance of this, which is, how do we begin to unpack, if you like, race as a social construct and really dissect out what are drivers of disease? Because we certainly have genotypic differences, as you point out, myeloma, but a lot of the disease burden has phenotypic influence around access to healthcare, or lack of, and a variety of other things. So how would you recommend we think about that going into each disease? I don't know whether Roxanne or Amit, you'd like to lead that off.
I can certainly start on this one. And like I said, Nick, I think, it's a very important question because we want to continue to drive research from that perspective, right? And the example that I was giving in multiple myeloma is a very good one where really this is something that a priori would have been very hard to sort of, point at or even hypothesize. And really the only way to be able to do this is by collecting the data, continuing to investigate some of these open questions, generating and confirming hypotheses, right? And so the 1114 example is a very good one where we were able to use real world data. So this is, a 3,000 patient registry where you sort of start to see the signal emerge of African Americans having a different outcome than whites if they had this particular cytogenetic feature. And the question that you're raising is that related to access to care? Is that related to just the sort of other social constructs that usually have a huge impact on outcomes? And you really need some big data sets to be able to address this. And so we were able to do that in this particular study, where you can tease out, even with the same treatments, even with the same access to treatments, patients have a different outcome. And then you have to go back and actually confirm this. And so subsequently, there have been other groups who've independently demonstrated and confirmed this. And now there are actually trials that are going to investigate particular agents which are actually targeting this particular cytogenetic change. And so this is a beautiful full circle story here, linking back to what Dr. Rodney was saying about precision medicine, where now you actually have a medication which precisely addresses the cytogenetic change, and how neat it would be to have a drug that impacts this directly.
Yeah, no, I think that is a great example. I mean, because as Roxanne said, so much of the driving data we have for precision medicines is drawn from a largely Caucasian population, right? So this sort of reverse engineering by using real world data to drive you back to the precision medicine, I think is particularly informative and powerful, right?
Yes, and if I may add, Nick, I think that this is why the large genomic databases do need to increase their diversity with regard to the samples that are in those databases. Because there are genetic variants such as loss of functional alleles, or also with regard to metabolism, there may be fast metabolizers and slow metabolizers. And this data is very, very important because there may be subgroups who may be have great efficacy with regard to a particular IP, and there may be others where it may be potentially not efficacious. I mean, a perfect example of that is with regard to Plavix, which is medication used as an antiplatelet. I would think that the FDA does have the All of Us genomic database, and that the purpose of that is to increase diversity in data collection, because it is very impactful with regard to exposure, response, and ultimately patient care.
No, I think that's true. So I want to go to a really good question that came in from Judy Galindo. And Lorena, maybe I'll pitch this to you to get us started.
Thank you, Nick. And I think your question, Judy, around what exactly are we doing to support that sites are more available, or that the community that the sites are serving has opportunity to trials, is very relevant to this conversation. What we have been doing at BMS is we apply the learnings from our experience to every clinical trials, and that's why we're purposefully identifying sites that are closer to the communities that we need to serve, and we are listening to that community, and that's why starting this year we established an aspirational goal that would allow us to assure that at least 25% of our US sites for all of our new registrational trials are located in areas that are racially and ethnically diverse. So that is one of the many steps that we need to take, and we are in a good track to succeed or to deliver on that commitment. That's something that we have committed to. And the other important component, which also tags into the question that Alma also added in the chat, we are looking into supporting the sites on trainings on unconscious bias, inclusive behaviors, diversity in clinical trials, because yes, race and ethnicity is super important, and we know that we need to make strides and impact there. But we need to look at all the other underserved communities, such as the elderly community, LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, and veterans. So we believe that by supporting building these inclusive behaviors and assuring that sites take that deep assessment on what are their diversity behaviors and inclusion behaviors as well, is going to be helping us helping everybody in the near future.
Yeah. And Lorena, maybe just to add to that. So I think, Judy, if you're still on the call, I think, many companies, certainly our own, actually have portals where you can submit an interest. And I know that can be difficult perhaps to go to individual pharma companies, but I think you'll find, companies like Syneos and many other providers, because we work with such a broad spectrum of companies with different drugs and diseases, we've created these portals for registering where you can actually submit an interest, and then we'll get back to you. And I mean that broadly across the industry. That's not a shameless plug Syneos. So if you have specific interest, I know you mentioned sort of metabolic and psychiatric conditions, we'd certainly be interested to connect with you. I can tell you, for example, we've had a great experience working in the same sorts of communities you're describing, just happens to be in Washington, D.C. with Dr. Fabian Sandoval, who has done some spectacular outreach into those kind of communities. And maybe there's some good connections we can make there. So maybe you and I can connect directly through SCRS, Judy. I want to maybe switch gears a little bit in the few minutes we've got remaining. You know, we've talked a lot about how lots of things need to come together, right? There's education, awareness, acknowledgement, there's community outreach and sustainability, staff that, you know, resonate with the patients that they're trying to take care of. But maybe to the panel, if I could ask you to name your top 3 things that you could advise physician investigators and their staff that they could do to participate in more diverse clinical trials. What would those 3 things look like? And maybe Amit, I'll start with you and then we'll go to Roxanne and Lorena.
Yeah, I think, you know, Nick, maybe if I had to sort of name a few things that I think could be very helpful. The first is really, you know, as we think about patient education, making sure that patients are comfortable with getting on clinical trials, right? So Roxanne touched a little bit on some of the past history of you know, how some of this distrust has really, you know, come into the system. And so I think we need to make sure that patients feel empowered and educated to make the right decision. I think the other one that's really important from a site perspective is to as you were saying, you know, really reaching out and having conversations with sponsors about talking about what their sort of, you know, patient populations look like as sites are looking to expand into those particular areas. And then ultimately, I think really sort of, you know, improving diversity of the investigators, the research staff. I think, you know, I mean, you mentioned some of the work we were doing with ASCO before. This is really, I think, you know, one area where the impact is such sustained impact, right? Because if you have, you know, investigators who essentially look like patients and research staff who look like patients, I think that can go such a long way. So those would be the few things I can think of.
Yeah, I mean, I will completely resonate with your last point there about conscious hiring practices, right? I remember from the guys at Winship when they turned their program around, they put an active diversity plan in place for all of their staff, right? They weren't just picking on one component. And I think that goes back to something that Lorena said in her introduction, that all of this change has to begin with commitment from senior leaders, whether that's at a pharma company, at a hospital, at a CRO. If you don't have that support and commitment from senior people, then nothing really will get as much traction as you need. So, a great point. Roxanne, from your perspective, you had to pick 2 or 3 things. What would they be?
Yes, I definitely go back to that a rapport, because as a physician, clinician, you need to establish a rapport with a full range of patients in order to be an effective physician. And to be an effective physician, that means that your patient will be compliant with what you prescribe. And I see research as an extension of that. And I think that once physicians have established a rapport with the patient and then will engage with the patient in a conversation, I don't think that it can occur where, you know, you don't really have a rapport or understanding of the patient, but then, oh, there's a clinical trial that maybe this patient might fit into. So, you know, I'll get the study coordinator maybe to explain to the patient. I think the patient likes to see, I think the study coordinators are definitely important and serve a role. But in my view, that initial engagement should come from the physician so that they can explain the purpose of the study to the patient. I see that as key with regard to PI and patient interaction, and certainly the diversity in the staff. And I think a commitment. It is it's a commitment that recognizes that there are health disparities that exist, and as a physician, how can you contribute to that? I think sometimes an individual physician may think, well, I'm not sure what I can do, you know, but I think you can contribute at that level and have an impact where you are by engaging with the patients and not and approaching the patient, not saying, oh, I'm not even going to consider asking this patient or so, because I think that they probably wouldn't agree to be in the study.
I think that's good, Roxanne. Thank you. And then Lorena, maybe just to close this out, if you had to pick your top 2 or 3 things to encourage people to think about doing differently, what would they be?
Sure, thank you. I think that if we all have a responsibility and a role to address health disparities. So let's assure that this is not a competitive space, a collaborative space, and share best practices, understand what is working, partner with community outreach organizations, ask for help, and listen to what the patient really needs. That's the first one. The second one is we do need to build the processes to make this sustainable. This is not the flavor of the month. I am super happy to see how all pharma is now looking into this. Let's hope that this stays. And my third point would be, let's not forget what brought us here. So so we all continue helping improve the journey of the patients all throughout their trials and whenever they are in need of a treatment.
No, that's great, Lorena. Thank you. So Dawn, I'm conscious we've run a little bit over, so let me pass this back to you to wrap things up.
Thank you all so much for all of your insight and your time today and sharing of your experience. The group definitely felt very engaged. So thanks to all of you as the attendee group for asking those great questions and keeping the conversation going. As I mentioned in the chat, please do hang on because the post-event survey will show up in your browser as soon as we shut down the meeting. So please do that. And if you are looking for contact hours, please be sure to answer all of those questions that do talk about contact hours and collector information. So thank you all, and we look forward to you joining us next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.